the directions for the two short papers for the class are both up there in the folder on Blackboard. Did you all see that? Okay. All right, so they changed the paper due date just to give you a little bit more time because I wanted you to be able to discuss it in recitation this week. So the paper is going to be due next Tuesday in here in recitation. And we actually want you to print them out and give them to us in hard copy. That just saves a lot of hassle with emails that get lost and so on and so forth. So print them out, bring them here in hard copy. It's 3 pages double spaced approximately, right? If it ends up being 2.5 pages or 3.5 pages, that's fine. You don't need to stress and make it all funky fonts or anything else like that. But do you have any questions about the topic of the paper? I wanted to just make sure that you understood that it's an analytic paper. It's asking you to think outside of the box of just the readings, but it's asking you also to draw on the readings. So there's no right answer to the question that you've been given. We just want to see what you think and how you can argue for your conclusions.
So if we incorporate like outside sources, we should still cite them.
Yes.
Into the readings we've already done.
Yep, absolutely. So you want to cite everything that you're using, the materials from the readings, anything that you're getting from outside. And as far as I'm concerned, you can use any citation style you want. You may be familiar with different ones, or you may not be familiar with any of them. In recitation, they can cover that as well too. So what are your different options for citation styles? Other questions? No? Okay, that's easy. All right, and so you also have the topic for the next paper, and I wanted to give you that early because what we're asking you to do for the next paper is to actually take interpersonal conflict. I know we've been talking a bit about international conflicts, but we're also going to be talking about interpersonal conflicts, families, communities, things that might be happening, you know, in your dorm or in something that you're involved in, your workplace, and so on. So we want you to start already thinking now about what you might use for that short paper. Okay? All right. That's easy. All right, so don't worry, don't stress too much about it. I know that that's the first paper for class, but you'll have lots of time to talk about it in recitation. And then you'll sort of get feedback in a sense of how you're doing. So I like giving lots of short papers rather than just only exams because I think it just sort of allows for you to, you know, draw on the readings, to be able to argue your own opinions and perspectives, and it's just good practice for the rest of your life, right? Writing is a skill that you're always going to need no matter what you end up majoring in, no matter what you end up doing with your life, right? Whereas taking sort of timed exams is not really sort of what you're going to have to do in your future life, you know what I mean? So we're going to have a mix of assignments. Okay, all right, so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be thinking a little bit about, so this is the title, mediated perceptions. We're going to be thinking about images. We're going to be thinking about sort of how we know what it is that we know about conflict, or what it is that we think about conflict. And we talked about this a little bit at the very beginning of class when we drew images of war, we drew images of peace, right? There's a lot of images of war, there's a lot of images of conflict out there in the world that you guys are seeing every single day. And so we want to talk about how those images get mediated, so how they get filtered, so what kinds of other information, what kinds of other assumptions we're bringing when we look at images of conflict. So in a moment I'm going to show you an image, and I want you to tell me what it is that you're seeing. And then I want to pull it apart and sort of think about where do we get our interpretive frameworks? Where do we get the frameworks that we use to see something, to try to understand what it is that we think it might mean, okay? So I'm going to show you an image, and I'm going to give you about 5 or 6 minutes. Hopefully you have a piece of paper. I know most of you do have a piece of paper in front of you. 5 or 6 minutes, I want you to just jot down what you think this is a picture of, okay? What you think is going on here. What do you think, who do you think this person is in the image? What do you think the context is that led to this image? Just sort of jot down your thoughts, and then we'll talk about it a bit, okay? So I'm just going to give you a couple minutes. Some of you may have seen this image before. It's quite a famous image, okay? So what do you think this is? Jot down your thoughts. Who do you think this person is? What do you think is going on? Where do you think this is taking place? What is this an image of? Nice pink computer. Very cute. Okay, so for those of you who are coming late, what I'm asking you to do is just take a couple of minutes and just sort of jot down like what you're seeing here. What is this? What's going on? What does this image call to mind for you? One of the hard things about running this, and I've told the ELA people this, is that, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk for about 10 minutes and then give you more information, right? Okay. But one thing that's hard for the instructor is that all of these sort of questions, it's hard to keep them all in your mind, right? Yeah. So you can help me sort of just look at this as raising these questions. We just start off with this one. And then you get more information, right? And the point of it is just to see how your assumptions shape what you're seeing. So how many of you have ever seen this picture before? A lot of you, right? Okay. So I'm going to ask you if you've seen it before and if you know a lot about the image, just to kind of suspend maybe what you know, so that those who haven't encountered the image before.
A couple years ago, I actually attended journalism. Is this Hill-Hoosie?
No.
Okay, never mind.
So you don't know.
I thought I did, but I don't.
Okay. It's a famous picture. It won the Pulitzer Prize. But let's just start off with the basics. So what do we see here? Anyone? What's going on here? Yeah.
I wrote down that it's in like looks like a very rural setting, pretty underdeveloped, and a fatigued, malnourished, unclothed looking child is being, I guess, like it looks like prey to that massive herd.
Okay, so that's a lot in there, right? So this is somewhere rural and, quote, underdeveloped. This is a starving child.
Yeah, like malnourished,
unclothed, fatigued, and there's a bird in the background. And what's the bird doing?
Well, the bird's clearly, it looks like he's looking at the child, but it's also a vulture, so I think since they're scavengers, he's kind of expecting for this child to die, so he's kind of like...
Okay, so what you know about vultures is that vultures only eat things that are already dead. Okay.
To me, it looks like the child's praying, almost like praying for help. He knows he's dying because there's a vulture there. So maybe he's praying to whatever God he believes in to either die or to be saved.
Okay.
Yeah, me.
Yeah.
I think this picture just brings awareness that there are poverty in other countries, and it's like help. Like, look, this is what's happening. Help.
Okay. So we already are assuming that this isn't in the U.S. Is that what we're assuming? Nobody's thinking that this is in the U.S.? Why? Just wondering.
Because it's not, I don't know.
Because everybody in
It's
the U.S.
not,
wears
like,
clothes.
common for really anyone to become that like malnourished or just be in that sort of situation in most of the United States.
Okay, because we have vultures, right? Like, that's how you knew what vultures were, right? So we have vultures, we have children, but it doesn't seem like something that would fit our,
His necklace looks like it's made out of bone, and that would be more of a tribal thing.
Okay.
to me.
okay, so we're assuming it's not in the US, and we're assuming it's a he?
I was gonna say, yeah, that was my first thought when I saw it. The necklace looks like something from like Versailles or something like that.
Okay, what, do we have any thoughts about the gender of the child? He, she? Huh? Why? Why do you guys assume it's a he?
I just went with he over the general, just to give it a gender.
Okay, the generic he. Did anybody sort of assume it was a girl wearing a necklace? No? Huh, interesting. Okay, so poverty, prey, the vulture is prey, the child is maybe preying. We're assuming this isn't taking place in the US. Where do we assume this is taking place? Where do we assume this picture is located? Africa? Anybody else?
Some country somewhere.
Some country somewhere. Okay, Africa or some country somewhere? Anybody have any other thoughts? No? That's kind of shared. Okay, anything else about this picture that you saw? Or that was basically sort of what we,
He's got an armband. It doesn't really look like a bracelet to me. It looks like some kind of
like a hospital
yeah,
armband?
like hospital or something.
Huh, okay. Okay, so there's a question. So what else, what does this picture make us question? What do we think, what do we want to know when we see this picture?
I want to know why photographers stopped to snap a picture before helping that obviously dying child.
Most excellent question. Okay, good question.
I wrote down, why does he appear to be alone? Why does someone that little have no one around him?
Yeah, where are the other people in the picture? Anybody ask that question? No?
To me, it looks like those structures, there like could be structures in the background. So I'm wondering if there was like an attack or something, and that's why he's by himself.
Okay, so we're thinking maybe it's violent. So the question of why is the child by his or herself? Why is there nobody around, and what sort of happened? Yeah?
What conditions took place before this event that caused it to lead to this? Not just like within maybe immediately of the week, but maybe throughout history, what brought it here.
Okay, so you want to know like how this could have
Yeah.
developed that you're seeing the image you're seeing here. Yeah?
I'm also curious about what this image is trying to achieve, or who's using it with what population, or who's the focus group who's supposed to be looking at it, and what they want to provoke from it. Whether, I don't know, I'm wondering whether it's intended to bring out the questions that we're asking here, whether sometimes it's intended to bring out other reactions. Is this used for actual humanitarian reasons? Is it used for money raising? I guess for me, I'm wondering like what's behind.
Yeah, because if any of you ever have taken pictures, right, and certainly professional photographers, of which this was taken by a professional photographer, take like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures, right? I'm assuming that probably most of you on your phones have like rolls of like hundreds of pictures, right? Because that's kind of the era that we live in. And then you choose certain ones of those photographs, right? So this was published in the New York Times. Why did the New York Times choose this picture rather than another picture? What would be the context in which an editor would be making that choice, right? As you guys choose like how you're going to represent yourself on like Instagram or whatever it is that you're engaging with when you put up an image for the world to say, okay, this is something that I think is important for people to see. Okay, those are great questions. Do you have any other questions, Nina?
Well, the impact on the audience, on the people who look at the picture. I'm curious to see their reactions and what's next for them. What
Yeah,
they're
you guys
gonna
are.
do.
You guys. So you're giving me You're giving me kind of intellectual responses and questions. What is your sort of emotional response to the picture?
It makes me really, really sad that as a whole, like, nobody has stopped to help this, like, whatever, like, community he's from or whatever happened to him. It's like, so we let somebody end up like that, and that just makes me really sad.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it puts a lot of things into perspective, like things in our lives that may not, like, oh, I missed breakfast, I'm a little hungry, but this kid looks like he's gonna be eaten by birds. So
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
the trivial things in our life, it kind of goes to show like what's really important and what's not.
Right. So if you think about sort of whatever was in your mind, like right as you were walking into class, for me it was just like slight annoyance that I had to drive around to get a parking spot. Like you guys might have had just whatever is in your head, oh, I have to go to class, what a drag.
I was gonna say, kind of piggybacking off of that, it's priorities, but I would say for me that it's world priorities. Like, what have our leaders been focusing on, and what have we been focusing on that has elected said leaders that have allowed situations like this to occur for decades?
I'm a little biased because I feel like we have children in our own country that we haven't helped yet. So when I see ads and stuff for like third world countries and stuff like that, I'm always a little like hesitant because I'm like, we have people in our own country that we need to help. And although America is very powerful and we do have resources to help other countries, I feel as though we should help us first because Americans like stick together more or less than before we got in third
Yeah, I mean, I find it just really, really interesting that we're all sort of assuming that we're all just sort of immediately assuming, oops, that this isn't America. I find that really fascinating.
I just kind of looking at this, and vulture kind of represents how little power man has, or in this case, that kid has. I mean, normally, like in like a U.S. setting, most people wouldn't be in that position, so they could probably overcome something like that. But somewhere else in the world, they're just not as powerful to be able to, or that is a legitimate fear for someone else. It wouldn't be for us, but for someone else.
Okay. Any other sort of emotional responses to this? Sadness, anger, curiosity, right? I know some people were curious to know more, to understand sort of how this photo is being used.
I was curious what they did after this. Is the kid still alive?
Hmm.
They just walk away?
So how do you think most people respond to this picture, right? So if you saw this in the newspaper, right, or if, like last week I said, what you should be doing in general is kind of reading the news, trying to keep up with current events. So if you clicked on, say, the New York Times website and this was the first picture that came up, would you want to then read the story that went with it? Or would you kind of feel what some people have called compassion fatigue? There's so many images like this that are circulating in the media. Would you sort of click to something else?
I would want to read the story, but I would also want to understand, like, did the photographer stop and actually, like, do something, or did he just write the story and then say, the story is good enough? Other people will stop and save other people, or did he actually, like, do something? Right.
And that's a really important question. I think it's a really important question, like a framing question as we think about this class and what we're doing in the conflict analysis and resolution field, right? Even last week we had lots of theories, a very dense sort of academic kind of textbook that we were reading, but how does that help us to understand whatever is going on in the news, in the world, in other people's lives, especially for people who are suffering, right? Is that just academics, or is that somehow helping us to do something to make the world a better place? So I like that framing question a lot. Did you have one comment?
So I took a culture class last semester. We would see pictures like that, and it goes on with the idea of poverty porn.
Poverty porn.
Yeah, and how our generation kind of like, whenever we see something like this, we kind of get the idea that we're supposed to do something to help, and it kind of, but they say like it empowers the wrong kind of people, because when you see something like this, you're gonna want to donate, but you're not doing it for like the right reasons, and just kind of playing devil's advocate. So when you see this, you want to say, like, you want help what's going on, wherever this is, but at that time, if you're not really doing it for the right reasons, that there must be something for. I don't know, just giving
Okay, so there's different kinds of things that are motivating our compassion, and maybe they're the right reasons and maybe they're the wrong reasons, right? Or maybe we see or encounter images like this, but we're not really sure what to do. We're not really sure what's causing this, which is why these questions that you're asking about sort of what leads up to this, not just in a particular day, but over the long term, are really important questions, so we can better understand what might need to be done and where we might be able to insert ourselves.
I was going to say, I think pictures like this can be very helpful and informative if done with utmost respect and in a proper fashion. But I can also see the perspective that a lot of times it does spur the, oh, let me go donate $10 to this organization that keeps 90% of the funds, and then goes and drops food into African villages, which causes mass civil war, because then people raid the villages that do end up getting the food, and it can cause more turmoil for that population in the long run, just because I don't always think that we're helping in the right ways. And so sometimes I question kind of the motivations of the photo. I would need to know the context behind the story, but a lot of times I feel like when we use photography in this kind of a way to specifically spur an emotion, probably if it was in the New York Times and the mass populations, I feel like a lot of times we get the wrong result.
Okay.
We are trying to get help, but the way we're helping can a lot of times be hurting. So.
Okay, because obviously I think this moves us more. We feel more when we look at an image like this than say when we read Pruitt and Kim's chapter 2. I think, right? I don't want to assume, but right. So the photography is very, very powerful, right? So the idea of sort of pornography is actually a very interesting one. Okay, so to give you a little bit more context, so this picture was taken in March 1993 in the Sudan. So in a particular country in Africa, by Kevin Carter, who is a South African who went AWOL from his mandatory military service and decided to take up photography. He sold it to the New York Times. It ran it in 1993 on page 3, and the Times reported that the child was a girl who was trying to make her way to a feeding center more than a kilometer away. So it's a girl, which I'm not really sure why we assume that it's a boy, but it was a girl. There's immediate outcry from the public, so the kinds of questions that you guys were asking, so wanting to know what happened to this little girl. People were calling up the New York Times, and people were wanting to know what you wanted to know, to ask if the photographer had helped her, or if he had just left her there. What Carter said, the photographer, was that he waited 20 minutes to snap the picture, hoping that the vulture would spread its wings, because he thought that that would make for a more compelling picture, right? Rather than just kind of the vulture hunkered down like this, right? So if the vulture was going like that, it would be a better picture. So finally he took the picture, and then he sat under a tree to smoke a cigarette. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1994, and he committed suicide a few months later.
Did he help the girl, or did he just smoke a cigarette? That's what I think too, and I'm a little upset now.
Okay, all right. Yeah?
He didn't help her. So that's like, he got a lot of flack for the image, like him specifically, the photographer, because he didn't help her. Like he just, and then he felt incredibly guilty about it afterwards. I think it's also important to note that the photo is a forced perspective, so the vulture was actually not as close as the picture makes it look.
Did you read that, or do you know about photography?
I took a class.
Oh, cool. Okay.
This summer about humanitarian aid,
Oh.
and we studied this image.
Okay.
So.
Okay. All right. So the picture was sort of framed in a way that made the vulture intentionally to look closer than it actually was, and so he was waiting for it to.
Yeah.
So he sat there for 20 minutes and didn't do anything for the girl, and had to wait for the vulture to spread its wings. Any other? So after now that you've gotten this little bit of information, are there other kinds of questions that come up for you, or other kinds of thoughts that come up for you? What does this add to your perspective, this information?
I don't like the fact that he got paid to take this picture, but I mean, at the same time, he could feed himself, but the girl's still starving.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of my reaction.
So it's upsetting.
After reading like the first line where he said he went AWOL from his military service, I'm not really surprised that he didn't help her, because he doesn't really sound like an honorable person. Like, if you're gonna like leave the military, like, and not like go through the proper process, or like if you couldn't get out, like,
Okay.
not really surprised, like in his like past, like, would you really expect someone like to help?
Does anybody know? Does anybody know what was happening in South Africa in 1993? You guys might be too young to know sort of the history of what was going on in South Africa in 1993. In the very back, yeah. Apartheid, right? So he's a white South African, and the South African military is part of this apartheid system, which separates blacks and whites. Sort of in all. Think about sort of segregation in the US, but even more intense. And so in some ways, maybe his decision to go AWOL was maybe not wanting to participate in this system that was extraordinarily oppressive. So like yes and no, but maybe there's obviously something going on. He commits suicide a couple months after he wins the Pulitzer Prize, right? Which for most people you'd think, wow, this is the high point of my career for a photographer, yeah.
I just think like with the just the information presented, like I wonder if like what was the reason when he committed suicide? Was it because just this fact that he got guilty afterwards, or was it just like other things in his life?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder what the situation was.
Okay, so it makes you wonder about him, yeah.
I think, well, one, it's pretty disgusting that he capitalized off of somebody else's struggle. The fact that he just sat there and took the picture and was just kind of in a chill zone while this girl was clearly struggling. But not only that, too, the fact that we're really compelled to want to donate money so that things like that don't happen. But then we awarded him the Pulitzer Prize for this amazing picture, even though the backstory behind it is that he didn't even help her.
So it's like instead of donating money or trying to do things that are like what you initially feel compelled to do, maybe the better thing would have been to be like, you took this picture, but your motive behind that, what you did afterwards with it, by selling it and not really doing anything else honorable with it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the prize kind of, it contradicts.
Okay, so there's something contradictory going on. Do you think the New York Times should have published it, the photograph? Say if it knew that there was something else going on behind it? I like the way you raise your hand. You're like, I know the answer to this one.
I don't know if this is the answer you're looking for. But in response to that, how else do you propose we raise awareness about things like this going around the world? Because the New York Times didn't publish this for like some kind of just like voyeuristic reason. Like they published it to show what was going on in Sudan at that time. So it's interesting to like see the dichotomy of doing what you think we should do instead of like, because pictures are the most powerful thing. Like an image, again, like the cliche goes, says 1,000 words.
Yeah.
You can read an essay or you can look at a picture, and most of the time the picture will get people motivated to do something much more easily than an essay. So just curious.
So is it a double-edged sword maybe, right? So the picture, by publishing the picture, by taking the picture, it raises awareness, which is very powerful in a way maybe just a text article can't do. But maybe there's something else on the other side of that, on the other side of the so-called double-edged sword that is not so comfortable. Yeah?
I'm kind of going off of what you just said. I actually would disagree. Just due to the fact that even though a picture can tell 1,000 words, the words can all be misinterpreted. So just like this was a forced perspective. Also, I've also studied the picture in a class of mine.
Okay.
And it turns out that right outside of the picture zone, there are
Okay, I'm gonna tell you in a minute, or I'll let you tell us in a minute. Okay, so there's more. Okay, so there's even more. Okay, all right.
But also, something that is really interesting about humans looking at pictures. We can look at the same thing over and over and over again, and even if it's with the intention of gaining knowledge, we become desensitized to it. Just like, so if you look at Twitter feeds, I have a lot of friends that constantly post pictures of mutilated children that have been, that have died in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And, their argument is that, yeah, we're raising awareness. People don't know otherwise. But people do know. People do know what's going on. I mean, there's news broadcasts constantly speaking about it. There are constantly scholarly academic articles that are being released on it. The pictures are not necessary because when we look at them, what it does is if I'm scrolling down my Twitter feed or my Instagram feed or something like that, and I see a picture, I'll stop and I'll look at it, oh my gosh, I really feel bad. Like, what can I do? And then I scroll and I see another one, oh, okay. And then I see another one, and it gets to a point where I just scroll right past it.
Right, because you've already done that, it's already, yeah, right. And so like the cat picture is maybe more
It's
interesting.
elicited the initial response, but if I haven't done anything because of it, then it just becomes a nuisance.
Okay. Okay, so that's maybe the other edge of this double-edged sword, right? There's the possibility that this draws us in and causes us to sort of click through to that article and try to read more if we didn't know about that. But then there's the other possibility that these kinds of shocking images, that we somehow protect ourselves from them, right? So people have actually called it compassion fatigue. The idea that, we can't actually somehow seem to engage with them constantly, that we get desensitized to them, that they have to be more and more and more dramatic and horrific to actually attract our attention, right? That the more bloody, the more gruesome, they have to be really violating something, or especially artistic for us to actually.
I was going to say, even in this picture, he talked about the fact that he was waiting for it to spread its wings to make it even more dramatized. It's the same thing. He didn't feel like this was enough. I mean, clearly it won the Pulitzer Prize. It was enough in that year, at least. But still, we do desensitize ourselves to the world around us in the case of war and poverty and things like that, just because it's...
Because there's conflict going on all the time, right? I mean, you guys can click on a news site right now, and you can see lots of stuff about conflict. You can find out lots of information, right? You can find about lots of things that affect children in the world. Does anybody know what the biggest killer of children under 5 is globally?
Dehydration?
It's diarrheal disease, yeah, for lack of access to clean water, right? Which is amazing. So 1.5 million kids each year globally die from diarrhea, which is incredible because it means, first of all, there's no access to clean water, but it's also something that it's really easy to not die from, right? If you have very basic antibiotics and very basic something like oral rehydration solution, which is like water, sugar, and salt. So it's like indicative of just incredible sort of inequalities in the world. And most people don't actually know that. They assume that most kids die of maybe it's conflict, war, maybe it's some exotic something like childhood cancers or something like that. But it isn't. It's the most basic kind of thing that you can die from.
I was just going to say that we have to keep in mind this was 1993. There was no internet.
Yeah.
So there was no Twitter feeds with mutilated children when we took this picture. It was all, this was like he said, thousands of people called the New York Times.
Like on the phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this might have been one of the first, I don't really know, that the public has really mass exposed picture of someone.
Well, the New York Times has always printed pictures, but yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so it's in the pre-internet days. I think that is important.
Yeah, definitely piggybacking off that, regarding the time that the photo was taken, I mean, really, this is a graphic photo compared to a lot of photojournalistic pictures of that era. I mean, you really don't see much coverage about gruesome things. I mean, probably the Vietnam War was the first war that was really covered, and now you come to the 90s, and now you're seeing poverty and this aspect. So I don't think the public was necessarily desensitized yet, and that's why it was such a big shock.
Maybe, maybe not. Like there was a lot of images of famine at that time. There were images from Vietnam, which you're right, like really sort of changed the way in which war was covered. And it was really in many ways images, some of them really quite famous images of the war in Vietnam that sort of shifted the American public's mind about that war, right? Sort of pulled back the curtains and let us see what was actually going on the ground. But yeah, so maybe, yeah. I'm sorry, I kind of between the two of you.
Okay, I think it's important to note this is pre 9/11, so the American society as a whole was looking at the idea of going overseas differently. They were still hesitant because of Vietnam, but they were not as hesitant as they are now.
Okay, I think that you're right that today's generation is more aware in some ways of what's going on globally, but I think that's also kind of a class thing in America, right? So college students tend to be, but people who don't go to college tend not to be, right? So yeah, I think that we are a little bit more aware, so maybe it's somewhat less shocking. Is that what you mean to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen lots of pictures now.
I was going to say, just having to do with the time frame, if this was in 1993, this was also right after what happened in Mogadishu in Somalia in 1992, where we did lose, I believe, 26 American soldiers, and then there were over 1,000 Somalians that died, and there was a lot of imagery that was also posted about that.
Like Black Hawk Down, if anybody's seen, yeah.
And that was in the exact same time frame, and I know for a fact that there were newspaper articles, there were a lot of pictures, even videos, things like that were published having to do with that. So.
Okay.
So even though there was a lot of coverage about these things around that time, and people could be desensitized to it, if images like this were never published, people would never know. Like, photography is so powerful that when it's published by a credible source like the New York Times, even though the photographer was really not an honorable person to be posting a picture like this, if it had never been published, then I'm sure there's so much that would have never happened to try to fix the situation.
Okay, fair enough.
I think it's really interesting that it's such a famous photograph, but it was originally only put on page 3, and so it kind of raises the question what was on page 1, and why was this spoke to that many more people rather than the cover photo.
What was on page 1? Yeah, and I don't actually know what was on page 1. Any other questions, for give you some more information?
So I just a comment. I think there are a lot about the impact. So sometimes we don't know about the motivations, the root causes, or causes of a picture, but obviously some people felt differently when they see the picture, but some people don't do anything. And the argument could be, the gaps between the rich and the poor is everywhere. But some people don't really care. It happens. I'm sorry, I'm sure it happens. People might say, you know, poverty exists everywhere. That's part of the economic system. So it happens.
Or maybe it was her family's fault.
Or, you know, yeah.
Okay, so some more context. This is a version of the story provided by a Portuguese photographer who was actually at the scene with Kevin Carter. He says that they were flying with the United Nations on Operation Lifeline Sudan and were told that they could take pictures but not to wander off because the plane would take off again in 30 minutes. He'd never seen famine before in person, right, as a human, so he's kind of stayed near the plane. This guy Silva left briefly to go look for guerrilla fighters, and then he was also came back and was snapping pictures of starving kids. The mothers in the village, so the question of where were the adults, the mothers in the village left their children briefly to line up at the plane to receive food rations that were being brought in, and he was taking pictures of the girl when the vulture landed behind the girl. She was approximately 10 meters away from him. The vulture was approximately 20 meters away from the child, so as you said, sort of actually kind of far back. That's what, like 20 times 3, that's like 60 feet, right? That's pretty far. The structures at the back were the boundaries of a waste pit where the vultures were often scavenging for food, right? So it was kind of like the sort of village garbage area. And then after he snapped the image, but after waiting 20 minutes, he chased the bird away. So does this change anything for us, or is it kind of sort of more of the same? This is what you were what I said, like, don't add yet, right? So they were there actually as part of a relief effort provided by the United Nations to bring food.
Is Carter like did you mention that he's a white South African photographer?
I didn't. I told you that. I didn't put it on the text, but yes, he's a white South African photographer.
Yeah, because the fact that he's a white South African photographer says a lot, because during that time South Africa has the apartheid system.
Right.
And since he's white, he was raised without the knowledge of, you know, poverty and stuff, because he was surrounded with all he needs, and
right.
And during that time the system is that white is the top and then colored and then black.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he didn't know, and he was never thought that way. And besides, within his own country, there was this system that made him have this superiority among other people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's why when he took the picture, he was unsure what to do, because he never experienced before. No one taught him to be that way, because the whole system kind of molded him to be this person who never knows anything besides his community.
Yeah, maybe, right. So the idea of him as a white South African, like, we're not sure what that means, so we could guess, like, maybe that was part of why he had never seen famine sort of up close, because he himself, you know, didn't have to grow up in the situation that many blacks in South Africa did at that time, you know, in conditions of real hardship. And we don't know, sort of in his mind, sort of, maybe actually somebody knows, but we don't know right now about sort of what was his experience of race. Was he maybe inclined to dehumanize this child because that's the way in which he had been brought up in this sort of thoroughly structurally racist society? I don't actually know the answer to that, but those are all kind of more questions about sort of his motivation. Does it change it for us that anything about this picture, that this was part of a UN food drop? Do we think that that should have been in the picture? Is it a problem that, say, a helicopter with UN on the side and sort of bags of grain or rice or whatever weren't in the image?
Well, it makes me wonder what was like printed in the article along with the picture.
Mm-hmm.
Like, was all of this information given to the public, or was it kind of just, this is what's happening?
No, not, right, because that's why everybody was calling up the New York Times saying, like, what happened to the girl, what was going on, did the photographer, right? So it was more of an illustration for a story about the famine in Sudan and how bad it was.
Right.
Yeah.
It kind of makes it like, I mean, it's necessary for all this information to be given rather than, I mean, people won't be calling it New York Times and whatever, but it's important information.
But maybe you wouldn't want to, quote, do something if you knew that this child was sort of not very far away from a UN helicopter. Maybe you would sort of sit there as the viewer and say, okay, that's taken care of, right? So I can do something about some other crisis because this child is actually okay.
That's what I was going to say.
Okay. So maybe sort of the effect, if there is a positive effect of the photograph, maybe you would lose that positive effect. But it's a framed picture. So there are adults who are in this space. This child is not alone in the world, right? The mothers have just left for a minute to go get the food from the helicopter, which is about to take off. The UN is there. There's a number of people walking around taking pictures. There are guerrilla fighters, so there's obviously conflict going on. This is a famine-related conflict. There's a bigger context, and the photograph is a very, very sort of tight frame that leaves out like a lot of that context. Yeah.
I still think the information is important, because I think you can still gain public support if you provided the right information. So I think it's important for them to have said that the UN was there, only because we see that picture and it's like, why aren't we doing something? Like, what's going on that we're so, almost like, because Africa's like a whole, so far away, what are we doing that we're just so stuck in this country, we can't really do anything for anybody else? But the fact that there are people there who are helping, I think is really important.
Important to know, okay.
So, I mean, even if, all of that information wasn't included in the article, I still think it was important for some of that to have been listed. Maybe like use the picture as like the initial image, but then, spin it and say there are still things that can be done or continue to support, different organizations that support United Nations to do all those things. Or like, look what your support is helping us do around the world. Something of that nature, than just posting this picture where it looks like we're not really doing anything to help these people.
Just like observing the discussion, I guess, I think it's kind of funny how quickly you judge this man and made presumptions about his character and who he is as an individual. And then now that we have like all this information, I think we should be judging the New York Times, because the New York Times only gave us limited information like you did in the beginning.
Yeah.
And it created that effect. And you know what that did? That increased the phone calls, increased the amount of newspapers purchased. It got them more subscribers. So they're making this person like look horrible just so they can benefit economically.
Oh, making the photographer look horrible?
Yeah, through the article, through not giving all this information, and then having all the callers call in like, hey, what's going on? Did you help her? By leaving that as a question, led the people to question him, just the same way that we did.
Interesting.
And it made people more interested in the story, which
Right.
sold more newspapers.
Well, certainly if you were going to run an article about the famine in Sudan, if you thought that was important, right, to run that because that was something that was important that was going on in the world, you have a choice of images, right? You could do something like a graph with a lot of charts that would maybe show you sort of how sort of health and well-being and levels of income have sort of shifted during the conflict. You could run something like that, right? Or you could run an image like this, which is incredibly provocative. It's causing us to ask questions. It's causing people to call in, right? You could run something very, very graphic, or you could run something kind of dry and that was much more informative. And so they made a choice, the New York Times, what they were going to run, right?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is they can have the graphic, but they should also supply all the information. You know what I mean? I'm saying that the motive for not supplying all the information is questionable.
Okay. I haven't heard from you.
Now, I think there's this question that keeps coming back, is why did he commit suicide?
That's a good question. Do you maybe it was directly related to the photograph, maybe? Yeah. So some of our questions have to do with this guy, like his motivations, his emotional state, sort of his experiences growing up in segregated South Africa, sort of why he didn't do something more to help the girl, right? So even though the helicopter was taking off, why didn't he do something rather than sit there? So we have some questions about this guy, Kevin Carter. And then we have some questions about the way in which this image works once it's released into the world. What does this do? What does this do to our understandings of poverty? What does this do to our understandings or not understandings about conflict and its relationship to poverty? What does this do to our assumptions maybe about race, to our assumptions about class? I mean, think at the beginning where we all just assumed this has got to be Africa, and it's, for whatever reason, we think it's a boy child. So what does this do to those assumptions that we're bringing to our reading of the image? So we have some questions about him, and then we have some questions about like the broader kind of cultural and political context in which this image is published, released, and then read by people, right? So we also maybe want to think about sort of the average New York Times reader, someone sitting at home. Back in the day, people usually got their papers delivered to their house or sort of picked them up at the corner store, right? So when somebody opens the paper to page 3, what is in their mind? What's in their mind of the average American reader who's consuming this image, right? So issues of sort of the consumption of this image and what it does. Some of you have said it makes us question, it makes us want to know more, it makes us want to help somebody, it makes us want to engage, and some of you have said, oh no, maybe it actually desensitizes us and maybe it stops us from asking questions. So I think we have a nice set of sort of conversations going here.
Did the Pulitzer Prize know the story, the
of the whole story, or do they just like based it on the New York Times version?
The story of the image?
Yeah, did the prize he got, like the committee know the entire story, or did they just give it to him?
No, because no, I don't think they knew the whole story, and it's the Pulitzer Prize for photography, so they're sort of judging the quality of the picture and sort of what it's about, like rather than kind of the whole, it's not the Pulitzer Prize for like the whole thing.
I was gonna say, I think if we're going to criticize the New York Times for not putting in that information, it's important to realize that that child still looked like that with the UN there, or with, different organizations there helping them. And so I think that almost has the general public lose faith in the system, which we entrust. Like we think, oh, donate to United Nations, donate to solve these problems, donate money, but clearly that's not doing enough if that child still looks like that. And there are organizations helping him that are there.
Okay.
And so I think that potentially the New York Times, it wasn't necessarily trying to keep information out so that way people will buy more magazines. It may have been keeping information out so people will have faith in the system and continue to donate. I don't know.
I mean, that might be one of the effects, right? So we proposed that maybe seeing this and knowing that the UN was there makes us think like, oh, okay, so now I don't need to do anything. I can turn the page and look at page 4 instead. Or maybe it makes us ask, okay, if humanitarian aid really is flowing into this region, like why is it not working? What's actually the issues at stake, right? So it asks us to ask other sorts of questions. I'm pretty convinced that the New York Times like wasn't doing this for any kind of like malicious scheming sort of way. I'm pretty sure that it was just they wanted to run a story about the famine in Sudan and they thought this was a really good picture. That really, when you think about sort of what the editor's thought process was, it was like we want a picture that will make people want to pick up the paper, that was kind of it, right? And that graphs and heavy dense text, right? That's not as, I'm trying to find the word, not really kind of glamorous, but like exciting, right? That the picture would draw people in, right? Whereas a dry, dull, like as I said when I compared it to Pruitt and Kim's chapter 2, right? Would you rather watch a movie or would you rather read a textbook?
So you mentioned that this picture was included, and you mentioned that people call up asking what happened to the little girl, but you didn't mention whether or not the New York Times actually posted anything about the humanitarian aid effort being sent there. Everybody's just kind of assuming that that was also left out. So that's information we need to get from you that we're just kind of jumping on.
Yep, we're jumping.
Another thing is a lot of pictures like that in the news, they'll give context to the picture, but they won't give you an aftermath of what has actually happened anyway. I mean, that's most of, they use that picture to get your attention, and then they tell you a story. They don't necessarily tell you the specific story of that one person inside the picture.
That's right. Okay, more information then, because we are jumping. All right, so our questions about why he went AWOL, right, which you asked before. So he went AWOL from his military service as a protest against his government system of racial segregation called apartheid. He was a member of a group of 4 photographers who called themselves the Bang Bang Club, who were the first to capture images of violence in the townships of South Africa. So I think he thought of himself in some ways as a social justice photographer who was sort of committed to taking images of violence. And this was at a time when it was probably personally dangerous for white South Africans to be taking those kinds of images and sort of circulating those kinds of images and putting them out to the world. And so their photographs actually did raise international awareness of what was going on in these places that were very difficult to access. He committed suicide at the age of 33, months after he received the Pulitzer Prize. One of his fellow Bang Bang Club members, Ken Osterbrook, had recently been shot and died while he was covering in a war zone. And so he left his suicide note, "I'm depressed, without phone, money for rent, money for child support, money for dad's money. I'm haunted by the vivid memories of killings and corpses and anger and pain, of starving or wounded children, of trigger-happy madmen, often police, of killer executioners. I have gone to join Ken if I am that lucky." Pretty sad. So are our questions still about him? Still about him.
How much money did he sell the photograph for?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, yeah.
Clearly.
Not enough, right?
It's not like $100 or something. They don't pay it that much.
Even the New York Times doesn't pay that much for photographers. If any of you are thinking of taking up photography for a living,
Definitely like a status thing, though.
do
Like, they
weddings.
want their photos and that, like, and they just have the reputation.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's not a lucrative profession. People don't go into it, especially photography coming from war zones and conflict zones and famine zones. You don't go into it to become rich by any means.
Getting shot at.
Yeah, getting shot at, right? Yeah, yeah. It's a pretty intense job. So it seems maybe like he believed in what he was doing, right? Like he had some kind of a commitment to covering this stuff to do something good, but
So after reading that part of his note, I'm interested about what happened to his kids.
yeah.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like he was estranged from them because he had to pay child support. So I'm wondering, like, did they know that he had, like, took this picture, and did they know, like, who he was and what he was fighting for? Were they opposed to that?
Yeah, yeah, and if
Why
you were
was
one
he
of his
estranged
kids,
from
would you
them?
feel proud? Would you feel, how would you sort of feel if that had been?
He left his government as a protest. Like,
Yeah.
did his kids suffer for that? Like, is that maybe why his wife left him, because she didn't agree with him on
I
that?
don't know, yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know
yeah,
about his kids.
yeah, yeah. So there's complicated stuff going on, right?
I think the whole story kind of shows a flaw in the system in that listening, it seems like we're all looking, to what happens to the kids or whatever, but I guess there's a bigger picture in that the human rights scene is it's not complete, and that you have one person who feels personally responsible to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the majority of people feel like, okay, I want to feel, not necessarily good about myself, but have this peace of my mind that I did something even though it was little. So there's a lot of like money donations or whatever, but the fact is that in human rights, you need human work. Money's not always an issue. You need support for these people. These people need to know that they're not alone and the work that they're doing is actually working.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about making sure that everything's okay. Or like the UN and everything. It's not about, human rights is not about a collective. It's personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Maybe for all of us, right? Right? And many people, you're absolutely right, who do this work, myself included, oftentimes feel very isolated when you witness really horrific things that are going on, and you kind of have the sense that nobody really cares because they're too busy thinking about, this other crisis or this other war or, whatever is going on, with like Kim Kardashian or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like, and there's this sometimes on the part of people who do this kind of work, there's this real sense of that kind of isolation that you're putting this stuff out and people don't necessarily care. Maybe because we're fatigued, or maybe because we're confused, maybe because this is just too troubling to engage with, maybe we feel powerless, we're not really sure what to do, right? We want to do something, but we can't, and so it creates anxiety.
It's kind of similar, but the fact that with his, I guess, clamor for money, it kind of just shows how similar he and the child were. Clearly the child's in a rough place monetarily, but so was he. And for him, obviously, he's in a better position, but he was trying to bring awareness to the issue that this child's worse off than I am, and I'm not getting paid a whole lot either. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to be compensated fully for the type of awareness that he was trying to bring about, which obviously led to a bad state for his children, maybe, I don't know, maybe without a father, but stuff like that, unfortunately, just doesn't get the same attention as, like you said, like Kim Kardashian.
That's true, right? I mean, I'm sure you guys have sort of thought about what you might possibly do like after college, and there's the things that bring you lots of money, and there are the things that don't, right? So human rights photography is on the don't side, right? Being a human rights worker in general is on the doesn't bring you a lot of money side, right? If you want to make, where do people go now if they graduate from Mason and want to make a lot of money? Med school? Okay. Law school. Not law school anymore so much, right? Yeah, government, right? It's yeah, there's certain things like on a big structural societal level that we value more and that we value less, right? People who teach at public universities versus people who teach at private universities. There are things that we just don't, public schools, private schools, there are things that we just don't value as much, right? So that's important.
I was gonna say, you guys have all worked in these kinds of fields. What's your opinion on the emotion? When you're in a place like that, do you feel like you come back and, I don't know, is it more rewarding? Do you feel frustrated with the public? I mean, I'm sure it's a mixed bag, but could you guys all talk a little bit about how you felt doing that kind of work in very heated conflicts and in situations that are very troubling to most of us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll speak for myself first and then let you guys take a turn, but it's hard. So the majority of my work, I've worked on 2 big projects over the past couple of years. One is working with survivors of genocidal mass violence, so people who have seen family members slaughtered, people imprisoned as political prisoners for 10 or 15 years, or kids, grandchildren of people who were killed, trying to understand like how communities live after mass violence, right? And that's very hard. Some of these are like older folks, right? This is an episode of mass violence that took place in the 1960s. So some of it, at certain points in my project, I was thinking of this, like this is the project to make old ladies cry, because I'm talking to like 60-year-old women, 65-year-old women about what it was like for them. Some of them were sexually assaulted. And there's moments, absolutely, where you sort of end up feeling like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I, as a scholar, as somebody who's committed to issues of human rights, to working against violence, to finding nonviolent resolutions to conflict, like, why am I doing this, right? Why am I asking you, what happened to you? What was it like when your husband was killed? What was it like when, a military officer raped you, and so on? It's really, really difficult. And the same with my project that I've been doing in post-conflict Aceh, Indonesia, trying to understand. And I'll probably show you guys a little bit of it, because I've just made a documentary film about it. So I'll probably show you some clips from that work, but the same kind of thing, in this sense that a majority of you, I'm sure, have no idea that in 1965 in Indonesia, it was the 8th largest genocide of the 20th century. 1 million people were killed in 3 months. And if I told you, you would care for a minute, but it's not really gonna change the way probably you think about a lot of things, right? So sometimes I get cynical like that, right? You kind of go back and forth, but then sometimes you really feel, especially when people trust you with their stories, or trust you to carry like an image of them and their suffering, like back to your world, that it's really important work, that people have trusted me to go and tell a different kind of story maybe than the one that's being told about them. So it feels like a responsibility, and that feels important. Yeah, but
so for me, I currently work with communities in the Tonle Sap Lake. So it's in Cambodia, the biggest freshwater in Southeast Asia. So there are lots of community-based conflicts, or lots of poverty. Like you can't imagine, people don't have toilets. People don't have something very basic we have. And it's hard. It's hard for me. I was born and raised in big cities, and I had access to school, clean water. They don't. And restrooms, but they don't, because they live in the lake, and there's, not many people care for them. So, 2 biggest questions for me whenever I get back there: I'm gonna be in or out of the picture. How long I'm gonna be in this situation, and what I'm gonna do, and is it good to be in that context all the times, or sometimes I have to step back, be out to do advocacy and writing? So there's no straightforward answer, but I certainly find myself sometimes I got to be there to examine and evaluate their basic needs. So what do they need really? Maybe their needs are different from mine. And then bring back to cities and talk to people, how we're gonna do this. So I'm going in and out most of the time, and there's no template for that. And of course, it's shocking. It's not the first time it wasn't the first time I was there. I've been there since I was 18 years old. Came back so many times, but things don't change a lot. So it was shocking, and it is still shocking to me.
And that's maybe very different than somebody like Kevin Carter, who spent literally 30 minutes with this community, right? Took a very, very provocative image, then got back on the helicopter and left, and never came back, right? Yeah. And it's very different from somebody like Nina, who's been working with the same communities for, a decade, I guess, right? I'm not sure how old you are, but right. And for me, who's been working with people in the same communities in Indonesia for like 22 years now, actually, right? Where I don't just I'm Facebook friends with like hundreds of Indonesians who I work with. So it's not like a casual relationship. I spend a lot of time there, and I'm deeply involved in what's going on there and their issues, serving as a scholar and also as an advocate. So I think that that's really different. I think that there's something about that half an hour just to take an image and not really having time to talk to people about the context of what was going on, right? So like how is, what are the role of adults in that community? What are their concerns? What's going on? How does famine, because I think that we tend to think sometimes that famine is some kind of natural disaster, but what's the relationship of this famine to conflict? It's a human disaster. It's a man-made disaster, right? It's not just somehow that it's not raining and the crops are all failing. There's something deep, that's the way in which it's deeply embedded in conflict issues, things that humans are actually causing. And so you're not getting that context that really helps us to understand what is actually going on in a half an hour visit, right? So I think that that's also really, really crucial for us to understand as we think about conflict, is really thinking about root causes of conflict and not just sort of, even a UN helicopter is putting a Band-Aid on a very, very deep and dense kind of illness, right? It's only kind of addressing the absolute basic symptoms. It's not looking at what's the cause of this conflict, how is that affecting people, and so on. So I think that that's really different when you're talking about the kind of work that Nina does, right? And you have lots of probably like everyone, like ups and downs, like sometimes where you feel like you're really doing good and sometimes where you wonder and so on. So, but I think that's really different. I don't know if you want to add, Eddie, from behind the camera.
Then you actually said, I was just thinking my experience, and we have a picture of one child, but we are forgetting there is a whole village, there is a whole region. One person cannot help all of them. What that one person can do is actually to bring the truth, to bring the story back to the society that can help as a society to society. So you cannot kind of forget that, because as you know from this picture, okay, when we're looking like this, we already cover all of that, there is one child. But there is the whole village, and the guy just popped up for half an hour, as you said like 2 minutes ago. And what he can do, only thing that he can do is actually to bring the piece of that story back to the, let's say, civilization, and to kind of raise the awareness. So that is. But again, not to forget, because during the Balkan Wars there was a lot of hunger and everything. But in the same time, there was the UNRWA, the UN mission over there, and they had abundance of food. They were throwing food, and the village next door, next by, was actually starving. And I witnessed the situation when they had a party and they were throwing the food. Well, there is people over there who would really, not to say kill for that food, but they would be really appreciative for that piece of something. So we have kind of those two things to put in perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that seeing, so we talked about kind of the double-edged sword, and I think that one of the things that happens when we think about how people consume this image, right? The kinds of assumptions that it might kind of drive deeper or harden in people that they might already have. It might be, for instance, that somehow in this place called Africa, right, grown-ups just leave their children out by the trash heap, right? So there are certain kinds of assumptions that we have about, quote, Africa, which actually isn't a country, which is a continent, but this other place that we don't know much about and that maybe we're kind of suspicious about, this image could possibly kind of harden some of our racialized assumptions about what goes on in Africa, that children just kind of are left alone and that it's not civilization, for instance, right? But as Eddie is saying, it's crucial to understand that even if our impulse might be, I want to pick up this child, I want to adopt this child, I want to send this child $14 a month through Save the Children, right? You've seen the ads kind of on TV, right? So if you give however much it is, and then the child will write you a letter and you develop this personal relationship, right? It's not about this one child, it's about broader structures of poverty, of conflict, of inequality, of understanding like what happens with aid, how that gets implicated in politics, what it does, what it can't do, and so on and so forth. So the other side of the awareness sword, right, would be that this image might kind of reinforce our assumptions about Africa, about sort of what happens in famine, about what they're about, right? Maybe we think that we're bored with this image, or we turn the page because Africans just are naturally poor and we're sick of seeing it, right? Without understanding that this is about conflict. Oftentimes it's about conflict, the kinds of resources that we here in the US are consuming, right? So like the minerals that are in your iPhone, the diamonds that are on your finger for any of you who might be engaged or married. The things that we want here in the first world are oftentimes, oil, other kinds of commodities, are oftentimes implicated in conflict and have a pretty direct link to these kinds of situations, right? So showing the child alone, I think, is a really interesting thing to think about. What does this image do? Because the frame is so tight, right? That little thing that the wide angle, the close angle, that I think that's really interesting to think about how we consume this image and what it does. So on the one hand, it's awareness. On the other hand, I think that it may also reinforce some of our problematic assumptions, and it may also cause us to not ask questions that you guys are asking, like the broader questions about conflict. What is the context? So context is crucial here, right? I think that's the major lesson, is that context is crucial, and that we have frames that we use, that kind of maps in our head that we use to consume images, to interpret images that we see in the news every day, that we see on the television every evening, that we read about in our textbooks or in our newspapers or on our Twitter feed or whatever, right? And to really think about how those frames are constructed for us, how society constructs those frames for us, right? What assumptions do we bring? What kind of is taking place outside of that frame? The kind of questions that we need to be asking, if that makes sense, right? To really think about the frames that we have, that we've been given by our own society, that causes us to ask certain kinds of questions and maybe not to ask other questions. Whenever I do this, I'm always kind of interested. I'm also really interested in Kevin Carter and sort of who he was as a human, right? And your question, I think, is a really good one. I think that I was interested to then hear from Nina and Eddie sort of what that's like for them to do that kind of work, especially as you guys think about what you want to do with your lives. But in some ways, the questions about Carter himself as an individual, to me, sort of distract from bigger, maybe more important questions about what is really going on at the political level, at the economic level, at the level of global policy, at the level of what's happening in the Sudan that leads to this, right? So what is, you said at the very beginning, look, what ends up, what sequence of events, what sequence of relationships and choices leads to this, right? So Carter's interesting, but I think that he's really kind of almost not the point, right? The point really is to think about why this happens, and also what this image does, what it leaves out, what it focuses our attention on, and what it leaves out, and what are sort of the implications of this framing for what we understand about conflict and famine and what we don't understand about conflict and famine, right? So when we see images of sort of, when I asked you guys to draw war, when we see images of sort of things blowing up and children in pieces and sort of destroyed buildings and weaponry and so on, what are we thinking? What does that make us think about conflict? And then what does that make us, encourage us not to ask about conflict, if that makes sense, right? Right? If the biggest killer of kids under 5, really is a lack of access to clean drinking water, why is it that we don't know that? Why isn't that sort of our drawing or image of conflict? Why do we focus on weapons or flames or buildings collapsing or whatever? So I think it's interesting to think about the frameworks that we use to understand this image.
So your point is stories, images, and frameworks are not neutral. They cause us to see or not see something, and then lead to actions or inactions or some certain levels of engagement.
Any final comments on this?
I still remember the last time when I visited, the latest one I visited Tonle Sap, when I saw the conditions of people. I reflected on my life in the States and other American friends. What's the difference between, the fishermen's debts for generations and student loans in America? So suddenly I started to think, kind of draw the connections between Cambodia, America, and maybe Singapore, Europe. Students sit on student loans. So, and they, farmers and fishermen also live with debts for generations. For me, what's the difference here? I learned through different visits and thinking.
Final comments or thoughts? Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on desensitizing. So this girl on my team is from Serbia, and her view, I was talking to her about 9/11 on 9/11, and I asked her if she had heard of it before she came to the United States, and she said no, she had never heard of it, and I said, really? Like, because it was like a big deal in America. She said we had like so much other conflict and stuff going on in her country. So I just feel like in class like discussions like this, it's really interesting to hear from the non-American
Yeah.
side. And I know that we have a few people in here that aren't like American. And it just really gives you a different sense of like their view of the world because they experience different situations and they've seen things differently.
That comparison is just so valuable, and we can continue, you guys can continue that conversation in the recitations as well, where I think it's kind of easier than in the big room like this, right? But to understand sort of what it's like for other people and to really think about like what we take for granted and how we see the world, and that that's not by any means how other people see the world, right? That's really important. Okay, any other? No? Okay.
We were talking about